Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the first PSA Teaching and Learning Network webinar of the year. And special thanks to Barbara Piotrowska for coming along to talk to us. So Barbara is a lecturer in public policy at King's College who does mostly research on authoritarian states and incentives faced by bureaucrats within them, but it's kindly agreed to come along and talk to us today about some research undertaken on generative AI, which, if you're all in the same situation as me, seems to be the only thing I talk about these days in terms of what we do with AI. So I'm really looking forward to hearing about the sort of the findings that you've uncovered in relation to attainment and engagement with AI. So just for the record, the webinar portion will be recorded. So if you're happy with your screen on, fine. If you'd rather have your screen off whilst the recorded webinar is going on, as it will be uploaded to YouTube, absolutely fine. And then we will have a Q&A at the end, which will not be uploaded, so we can be a bit more free to talk and discuss what we've heard afterwards. Otherwise, thank you very much, and I'll pass over to you, Barbara.
Thank you, Adrian. I will start a timer so that I'm not waffling for too long. And let's go to slideshow from the beginning. Let's see if I can. This should be better. Can you see the slides?
Yep, we've got them up in the sort of notes view, you know, the present
Notes view, yes, I know. Then I will, sorry, I'll switch it off because I used to have two screens, so I'll see. This makes it better. Okay, so that should be a more neutral view where you do not see my notes, which I think I have none, but this is going to be easier to read. So thank you everybody for being here. And this is the first time I'm presenting this paper, so I'm very excited to see what your reactions are and what we can learn from each other in that context. The paper is called Prior Attainment Affects Uptake of genAI-Based Learning Activities. So it's going to not only look at how genAI affects outcomes, but also how prior attainment actually affects engagement with genAI and hence affects outcomes. So my kind of motivation for this topic is that slight frustration with how people talk about genAI as being good or bad. I don't know. I think that the question of whether it's good or bad is just very underspecified. genAI is a tool. Just like a hammer can be used to kill somebody or to build a house, genAI can be used in different ways and can be used in different ways by students. So it, in a sense, has two faces. You know, it can act as a shortcut that undermines learning or as a tool that enhances learning. And so it's basically just depends on how it's used, whether it's used to automate or to augment cognition. And we do have evidence that both of these channels happen. So if you use genAI to automate your thinking, you are going to kind of be harmed by it. Your thinking is going to be harmed by it. If you use it to augment cognition, learning improves. At the same time, the thing is that not all students engage with genAI to the same extent and in the same ways. So by now, like the surveys that I've seen show that pretty much all the students are using it to some extent. So maybe that remark is a little bit less pertinent than it was a year ago when the engagement was more around 70%. So some students weren't using it at all. But what remains is that students engage with genAI unevenly and in different ways. You know, see point above, some of them rely on it more for augmentation, some of it use it for automation. And so benefits will vary very much depending on how students use the tool. And in particular, what I've noticed in my teaching is that prior attainment may shape both engagement with the genAI tools and the learning outcomes. So this is just the motivation for this paper. Now, let me just give you a summary of the paper, just in case you have to run. You know, you have a very brief summary of what it does, because it's not a very long paper, and the lessons are pretty clean. So what it does is, over the last 2 years, I've been teaching an optional course in policymaking in non-democracies. Since the beginning, since its inception, I've been embedding GenAI into weekly tasks as well as assessment. So that gave me 12 weeks every year. I mean, I only used for this paper last year, but every year I was integrating GenAI into 12 weeks of teaching a public policy module. And I use the lessons from that exercise to answer how did the tasks in interaction with student engagement affect grades in various forms of assessment. Because as you will see, nothing is simple in this module. There are various forms of assessment. I think they work really well, but it takes a little bit of time to explain how it works. So that's the question. What do I find? Most importantly, I find that prior attainment strongly predicts engagement. Students that are higher achieving in the previous term completed more weekly tasks that I assigned. And at the same time, when you look actually at grades, GenAI engagement did not independently improve final essay or policy brief grades once the prior attainment was controlled for. So at first it looks like more tasks completed leads to higher grades, but once you control for prior attainment, this effect disappears. So it's basically not that more engagement with tasks leads to higher grades, but quote unquote better students both engage in more tasks and just get better grades. So what looks like effects of tasks actually is just effects of higher prior engagement, prior attainment. On the plus side, what I do find, and that I'm quite excited about, is that in a reflection exercise, which is more of a process-based assessment, where students are asked to reflect on how they use GenAI to write a policy brief, engagement with more tasks has a separate effect on a grade in that reflection exercise. So it seems like actually working with them, regardless of how good your grades are, has effect on understanding how well it works in writing, in thinking about how useful GenAI is for writing policy brief. So that's the paper in a nutshell. And obviously now I'm going to go into much more detail. And also, I just wanted to say, I don't know if I can see chat. So if there are any clarification or other questions, Adrian, could you just jump in and let me know if I should, clarify anything. Otherwise, I'll just wait until the quick Q&A. Okay, so what did I know before starting to write the paper? The evidence base shows that, looking at the meta-analysis by Deng, that's probably the most recent ones, there are many, many studies showing positive effects of using GenAI on achievement when it's used to actually teach students, when it's not just used for automation, when it's used for augmentation. And these benefits have been seen in language learning, critical thinking, and in motivation of students to study. That said, as I mentioned, it's effective, that is GenAI is effective when used to augment, not to offload cognitive effort, as argued in the famous Cosmina paper that looks at kind of neurological changes in the brain when using GenAI versus own thinking. That said, what we also know is that lower achieving students adopt GenAI more, or they did as of 2025. This is a very dynamic field. Everything changes all the time. That said, all we know from this fact is that the students use GenAI more, not what they use it for. So again, we're in a hammer situation. We do not know what they use with this tool, they use this tool for. And AI literacy divide limits equal benefits. So that's kind of obvious. If they use it for automation, then the benefits might be a bit subdued, so to say. If they use it for augmentation, then there actually might be positive effects. Because note that the studies on the left, talking about positive effects, this is an average effect. So we don't know from that whether it's that, quote unquote, good students get much, much better, while bad students actually get worse. Or is it everybody getting better, we just don't know what the distribution of the effects is here. This is just, on average, everybody's better, but that might come from different sides of the kind of attainment distribution. And because of that, we're risking widening achievement gap if misused. Because, I mean, I always have, when teaching, this question, who am I teaching to? Who am I teaching to? Am I teaching to the best students, to the average students, to the worst students? But here it's even more important, like, what do we care about? Do we care about the best students getting significantly better, even if that means the worst students getting worse? I mean, these are all open questions that I'm kind of musing about right now, but I think they are very important in the context of introducing GenAI into learning. What the existing studies don't have, or the ways in which they can be improved. First of all, they're mostly short-term, so they're often one-off intervention. They're often experimental. So, it's basically students presented with one activity, often self-report how well they understand things, how much their understanding has improved. So there's often very limited control of prior attainment. And there is also a focus on what I call, it's very simplifying, but right answer disciplines such as math, computer science, language, as in disciplines where you can very quickly see if there's an error or not. In social sciences and in political science, public policy, it's more about quality of argumentation that we grade. Like, if a student makes a factual error, that's already a very low bar. We're more interested in the quality of understanding. And so the existing studies don't really look at it. But I want to emphasize that of the studies that show positive effects, they basically what they say is, after you give students this tool, they do better. What I'm saying is, unless you know if better students use this tool more and then do better, unless you control for that, what you might well be seeing is that better students engage more and at the same time get better grades, and you cannot disentangle whether this is simultaneous causation or this is actually effect of GenAI. So how does this paper try to address the gap? Well, first of all, it uses a naturalistic 12-week classroom embedded study. So this is students in their natural environment with their natural set of incentives, that is grades, behaving as they would if this was a kind of, this is actually a natural course. My paper uses a robust measure of prior attainment. In particular, it uses, because the module was held in the second term, I can use the students' grade average from the first term to control for their previous attainment. So that's their grade average of the previous term courses or modules. And the other thing is, what is important for us in this room is that it extends the evidence beyond the usual STEM and language learning, as it's conducted in a postgraduate public policy course. So the fact that it's postgraduate might have some effects on what I'm seeing, but this is not something I'm going to discuss right now. If you want to, we can discuss that in the Q&A. But the point is that I think that the use of GenAI for learning in STEM and language learning is going to be quite different than how it can be most productively used in social sciences, where as I say, like the perspective taking, the quality of argumentation is just the paramount importance. Okay, so before I go to the study, I will bore you. I don't know, I find it very exciting. I will detail what my course actually looked like in terms of embedding GenAI into the teaching and assessment. So the setting, as I said, it's a master's level optional module, policymaking non-democracies, which kind of fits with my expertise, held at KCL. And available to students from various social science modules. So it's not just public policy students, it's students from everywhere within our faculty, including war studies and degrees beyond public policy. It is as I said, a second term course, important because I have attainment from first term. and it lasts 12 weeks. However, the GenAI activities, I did not introduce them in the first and last week because of, well, basically it's just kind of hard to do anything in weeks 1 and weeks 12. Now, a little bit more about the GenAI activities. I will go through examples of what they look like week by week, but to just give you the general principle for how I thought about designing them. My main idea was to show students different use cases for how you can use GenAI to augment thinking and learning. And so there was a different use case introduced every week. And frankly, what I hoped this would do is it would just keep students thinking about the course material for just a little bit longer than they would if I just gave them, I don't know, a discussion question or, just like a reflection question. So I thought that by, having a slightly different activity that might maybe make it fun, they would just stay within the substantive topic for these 15, 20 minutes longer. And that's how I maybe can induce learning, regardless of how successful any individual intervention is. So that was the general principle. We have been relying mostly on ChatGPT. That's not the recommended GenAI in my institution, that's Copilot. But the reason why I use ChatGPT rather than Copilot is because for half of the tasks, the students were actually using custom GPTs that I built for them, and it's impossible to build GPTs in Copilot or in Claude, which would be the natural alternatives. So that's why ChatGPT, but this would all work with any other GenAI. Now, assessment structure, unfortunately, this is how deep I have to go in the description to explain what is it that I'm actually doing. The assessment structure included attendance and preparation, not participation. The reason why I called it attendance and preparation is because this is where I counted students' engagement with the weekly GenAI activity. So I treated it as a homework, if you will, but this was graded in a binary way. This whole grade is much more complicated, but all you need to know is that it was graded in a binary way. Either a student submitted a link to their conversation with ChatGPT or they didn't. I did not go into anything more granular, primarily because it was a course of 73 students and I would have to otherwise grade weekly 73 conversations, and that was just not feasible. The second mid-size assessment bit was a policy brief accompanied with a reflection exercise. I will discuss it in a bit more detail, but here the idea was the students were writing a policy brief using GenAI to the extent that they wanted to. I put no limits, but then they also had to write a reflection piece in which they spoke about, basically how did it go? What was their approach? What challenges in fact they found? How did they divide the work? As well as future of a policy advisor profession. So the idea was here that students would kind of engage with their metacognition, thinking about, how useful is this tool? What makes it useful? What makes it not useful? I absolutely was happy for students not to use any GenAI, as long as they could tell me specifically why did they not use it. So they could still get maximum points for that part if they basically had a very specific list of reasons why they weren't using it and why they didn't divide work at all. And then the final part is the research essay, which is the kind of classic academic essay, accounting for 70%. So one thing from this assessment structure that I just want to point out is that because of this attendance and preparation and the policy brief and reflection exercise, students were incentivized to engage with GenAI, but because they weren't counting for a lot, there is a variance to the extent to which they did in the end. So because the ANP is only 10%, if they decided not to do anything, that was still wouldn't affect their grade to a significant extent. So this kind of left them with a bit of discretion of where they did or did not want to do the weekly activities. Because I was a little bit worried, and I'll check that in the coming years because I no longer have A and P grade, that if I do not have even this tiny bit of kind of incentive to engage in the weekly exercises, that I will get very few students actually engaging in them. But we'll see in the coming years. So these are the weekly tasks, and I'm happy to share them with you. I'm happy to, discuss them more in the Q&A. But let me just go through 3 examples of what a weekly task would entail. So the first one in week 4, we had this word-based game. So a student would do research on the country that they adopted for my module, and they, for the purposes of the game, would be a leader of the opposition in this country. Now, what they're trying to do in the game is they're trying to stage a protest. They're trying to mobilize against the regime. The regime reacts, and there are like 3 rounds of what the opposition leader does. They're basically given a choice of actions, and then the game progresses. At the very end, there is a reflection exercise checking, kind of discussing with students how what they've learned maps onto collective action issues. So the whole purpose of this exercise is to show students how collective action issues can work in a real world, and how they might work in the specific context of the country that they're studying for my module. So that's kind of like an immersive way of translating theory into like an immersive exercise. Another week, so in week 5, what we've done is the students basically had like a policy brief generated by genAI. The brief itself didn't matter that much. The point was the feedback. So they were to ask ChatGPT to produce for them feedback from various perspectives. So it would be a linguistic perspective, or a country expert perspective, or subject perspective. The idea here was to show them how A, feedback matters, and B, how feedback from different perspectives can add to their thinking. And so here that was kind of to show them that feedback matters, but also to show them one use of genAI. Sorry, I just got a message from Rose. Thank you, Rose. I hope we see each other at another occasion. So yeah, so the purpose of that was to show students how they can use genAI to enrich their thinking by looking at the same problem from different perspectives that maybe they wouldn't think about naturally. And let's take another example. Let me see if I can still do it. Yes, is in another week. What we've done is training and developing strategies for spotting misinformation. And what I mean by that is the students were meant to do some research on, that was week on climate change and resources. So they were doing research, separate research on climate change policy in the country that they have adopted. Then they would go to ChatGPT, which had a custom-made GPT, asking them, so what country do you want a policy brief in? They would say what country they're studying. And genAI would generate for them policy brief on climate change policy with inbuilt 3 pieces of misinformation or opinion disguised as a fact. And the purpose, the task that the student had was, first of all, to find the pieces of misinformation. And the second one was to think about how they went around finding a strategy for spotting misinformation. So again, it was combining substantive knowledge with more of a metacognitive outcome. So that's just a couple of examples, and happy to go through the rest later on. But the typical task structure was very much embedded in like the PAIR framework and another similar framework, which is a bit of a sandwich. So starting off, independent research by students on a given topic of the week in the country that they adopted for my module. So they would do that regardless of GenAI. Then they would go to the GenAI and have the GenAI element that was trying to use that material that they've collected to augment their thinking and to bring it back to the course and very often to the theory aspects of the course. And then in the seminar discussion, we would always have time for reflection on, how useful was the particular use case for GenAI and augmenting their thinking. And I was always very clear that they should tell me if it wasn't useful and remember that. Because, if in an interview they are asked if they use GenAI and they say no, that just makes them sound like a Luddite. But if they say that no, because they have used it for this one thing and it just wasn't useful in the following ways, then it's a much more informed kind of discussion. Okay, and this is the last part. Don't worry, this is the last part on the course. But just to kind of dwell a little bit longer on the assessment. So let's start with the research essay on the right, because that's the easiest one. That's the one we're all familiar with. That's content focused. The students were asked not to use GenAI generated text. They were permitted to use GenAI for learning previously, but the text should come from them. It was measuring, as usual, quality of argumentation and substantive content. And I'm happy to talk about how I think I fairly successfully managed to get students not to use AI-generated text, but I can do that in the Q&A. Now, moving on to policy brief and reflection exercise, there are like one bit, but they actually are two exercises within one, if you will. So policy brief was again content focused, i.e., I would grade how good the content is. The use of GenAI was unlimited, was encouraged but not required. The goal was just to write the best possible brief. And what I think I've learned from this is it's quite shocking how students, if they know they can use GenAI as much as they want to, they can still write pretty terrible briefs. So it's not like, GenAI just is a great leveler that gets everybody to the same level. And this was measuring the ability to use the policy brief format, deep insight, and contextual understanding. And then the other element was the reflection exercise. And so this was more metacognitive. This was more about the students thinking about their process. There were 5 reflection exercises focusing on the experience, challenges, division of labor between human and AI, and justification for those, as well as the future of policy advisor. So, as I said, this was measuring metacognition about GenAI use. So it wasn't, in this particular exercise, they wouldn't be using it, they'd be talking about using it and their experience using it. Okay, so this is, as far as I remember, the last slide on the course that isn't actually about the findings. So now moving on to the actual study, and this part will be relatively short. So the objective is coming back to my original research question. First of all, to evaluate the determinants of student engagement with GenAI. So who engages more with these weekly tasks? And then the second one was the effects of this engagement on learning outcomes as measured by the grades in the different assignments. So as I basically have 2 dependent variables. The data I'm working with, so that's a data from a course, as I said, it was 73 students. Not everybody signed basically the permission to use their responses for my research. So I ended up with 68 students in my sample. What I am working with is whether a student submitted a task every week, the number of exchanges, i.e., did they have a back and forth? How long was the back and forth every week? Was it just like one answer? Was it a longer exchange? Similarly, I also have the number of words that the student typed. So, how much talking was going on. I don't care about how long the ChatGPT output was because, that's not an indication of anything. Then I also have grade average in the previous term as a measure of performance, as well as the course of study. So is it a student from a public policy module versus some other modules? And as you can see in the histogram here, the general engagement was pretty good. So on average, students engaged with just a bit over 5 tasks out of 8 tasks that they could have engaged with. Only 6% didn't do anything. So that's, only 6%. So that's, as you can see, like 6 students maybe didn't engage with any of the tasks. And then more than a quarter attempted all of the tasks. So I think that was pretty encouraging in terms of the general engagement. Now moving on to the results. As I said, first I'm looking at determinants of engagement and then at results in the different forms of assessment. So when it comes to determinants of engagement, really the only one that is really important here is the grade average in the previous term. And what you can see is that the higher the grade average in the previous term, the more tasks students engaged in, the more interactions they had, and the more they typed in. So it's basically the students that kind of figured out how to learn were more curious how to use GenAI for learning, is how I interpret it. And it's like the first finding from my data. And what I think is, it's particularly striking is that even though I only have 68 observations, the correlation is very strong. Maybe it's substantively not a massive effect, because it's basically if a student moves from 63 to 68 average, that would be associated with one more task fulfilled. I don't know if you want to think about it as a big or a small effect, but I think it's non-trivial. So that's result number 1. Result number 2 is grades. And as you will see here, these are grades in various exercises in various assessment types. So the first 2 columns are for policy brief, then it's reflection exercise, and then it's the final essay. The reason why there are 2 columns is in the second column, I control for the grade average in the previous term. And so first of all, it looks like the number of tasks completed has no effect on the policy brief grade, regardless of the controls. However, it is always robustly kind of correlated with the grades in the process-based exercise, so in the reflection exercise. So the more tasks a student engaged in, regardless of their grade average, the better their grade in reflection exercise, the better they understand how you can use GenAI for writing a policy brief. It doesn't actually translate into the grade node, but they are thinking more about it. Now, the third point to see here is that while without controlling for prior attainment, it looks like more tasks are improving student essays. Once you include the control, this result disappears. So what I'm saying is, I'm kind of worried that a lot of the literature that says using GenAI for augmentation improves students' grades is in column number 5, where they're not controlling for the fact that better students just know how to use this tool better. So that's the first set of results. Now, grade average, while number of tasks wasn't predictive of the policy brief grade and of the essay, grade average in the previous term is. So it is basically better performing students write better briefs and write better essays, regardless of how many tasks they engage in. Which was a little bit sad. I did think that the tasks would have some kind of additive effect, but they didn't. I can speculate why, but again, I'll leave it for the Q&A. And the final point I want to highlight is that degree 6, which is the most public policy degree, was very predictive of how well people were writing policy briefs and essays, which is just natural in a sense, because they already had a term of preparation of writing similar essays and potentially exposure to policy briefs in the previous term. So just to kind of summarize the results for, I think, the third time at this point. Prior attainment strongly predicted engagement. So higher achieving students completed more tasks, they had more exchanges, they wrote more. Now, moving on to the grades and results, genAI engagement did not independently improve any of these grades of the, in the final essay or policy brief once prior attainment was controlled for. So it looks like it's more better performing students at the same time do more tasks and have higher grades in their essays and policy briefs rather than the tasks actually doing any work on their own. On the other hand, what kind of encouragingly for me did show up is that and genAI engagement did enhance performance in the reflection exercise. So there seem to be some gains in metacognitive awareness of how well it can be used for purposes of writing a policy brief. So I'll just have a look at, I have a little bit of time. So I have jotted down some implications for practice, and I'll be kind of curious to hear your thoughts about it, because I don't think they're actually in the paper, but I think they might be quite interesting to discuss. Is point number one is that simply offering equal access to genAI is insufficient because students will use it for different things. And higher attaining students might take more of an advantage for using it for learning. And so what this might do is risk reinforcement of achievement gaps or even widening them. Because if you give it to everybody and then poorer performing students end up automating and actually learning less, while students like best performing students end up using it for augmentation and performing better, then you might get a wider achievement gap. So just saying, not everybody has access to internet, that's just part of the story. If you give everybody access, that still doesn't mean that the way students use it will be the same. So as educators, I think we should be, thinking of designing targeted support or scaffolding for lower attaining students. So what I have done in the module at the time when I started teaching it, I did not really anticipate the prior attainment effects. I was more worried actually about the gender disparity, because there have been papers looking at whether women and men use genAI to the same extent that were showing that women were using it less. So I was telling my female students that, there seems to be this effect. So just be aware that you might be sabotaging your own performance, not because you have to use this tool, but you have to kind of understand why it is useful or not. And the other point, the kind of more positive point, is that genAI interventions may be valuable for developing reflective competence and AI literacy, even if they don't directly improve content learning. The question is this something you want to do within your own course, within your own module, or should it be done separately? I decided to do it within my own module. My module had 3 objectives. I thought this was a lot, but I think I managed to stick it, but it was a lot of thinking about, it required a lot of thinking about designing it so that it all kind of fits together and that every week I'm speaking to every one of these objectives. And finally, that's kind of summarizing all of the above, that frameworks and institutional guidance should not think only about access, but also about strategies of meaningful engagement across diverse learners, because diverse learners will use this tool for, well, diverse things. So this is it from me, and I am looking forward to our discussion. I hope I wasn't waffling on for too long or too fast, but if there are any questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Thank you very much. That was a really, really fascinating talk.